what is the temporal lobe?
Where you see where your headset is,
Ye-
your ears, it starts
Yeah.
back with ears and goes right along the side. It's
Okay,
about
yep.
the side of two fingers, right along like this. The temporal lobe, it's under the temple.
Yep,
And
okay.
so it's about that long, and it's chock full of all sorts of goodies. Partially, it is what's called a visual association cortex. It puts together higher and higher forms of visual images, and then adds emotion to those also. So you start putting together a whole visual world there. It's one place where you determine what things are. Whereas the parietal lobe up on top, that information goes where things are. So you have this where and then what things are, and then you add emotion to it, and it's brought together in the frontal lobe. But anyway, so there's a whole part that has to do with the vision, and a whole part that has to do with the hearing. The auditory cortex is right along there, and auditory association cortex. So it's involved in not only hearing, but language. So it's involved in language. And then as you go forward, it's involved in balance. The vestibular system is partially involved. And then part of it is as you get down toward the tip of the temporal lobe here, the very tip is where you name things. You know, when somebody goes, what is that? You go, that's the, and you can't quite remember. And that's called anomia, the inability to remember. So people with damage to the temporal lobe at the tip, they have anomia. They can't name things. It's a normal thing, but they really can't name things, even though they know what they are. So there's all these little functions that go along with language and understanding the world. But also, as you go underneath, there's where the hippocampus is, which is so important for the acquisition of new memories. And it's very closely tied with the area deep in the temporal lobe, up near the temporal tip, called the amygdala, which is one of the great seats, the centers of the connectomes having to do with emotion. And so it's where emotion and a memory so emotional memories, that's where they start to become inured and put together there. And then one little part in the insula has to do with, when you have gut feelings about things.
Yeah.
So there's all these sensory systems that are involved in sensory association systems, language, and a lot to do with the processing of emotion and memory. So that's a lot of stuff. So you can imagine, one of the first places you see damage with people with those problems is in Alzheimer's. And that's where you start to see changes first in there, for example, but many other things. And so the temporal lobe can be a funny place because it's also the center of where you get, epileptic foci, where you have, epilepsy. A lot of it starts in the center here in the temporal lobe. It's a real center for that. And people have all sorts of odd experiences, where they have hallucinations and everything. And in fact, much we know about hallucinations, part of it's centered in the temporal lobe, and by hyperstimulation of the visual cortex back here, those working together. So hallucinations, but it's also, there was a great paper years ago by Arnie Mandel, late 1978, called God in the Brain. So the idea of our sense of God and the other world and spirituality is in most part localized in the temporal lobe. Okay.
Oh, wow.
And so if you stimulate it, you can get these visions of hallucinations, and you can get these visions of very otherworldliness. So whenever you think of somebody having some sort of ESP experiences or prescience or very odd experiences, you always think of the temporal lobe.